Bismillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Excellencies, friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight, we go back to one of the subjects that has been repeatedly discussed here at the Dar. It is a subject that never ceases to be both interesting and inspiring. The subject is Persian art, and not only Persian art in general, but more specifically the Shahnama. We had several scholars that discussed the subject before, but it is interesting to have a fresh look at it. Tonight, we are fortunate at al-Athar al-Islamiyyah to welcome an eminent scholar who specializes in this subject. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Charles Melville. He will discuss the Shahnama and the Persian arts of the book. He's a professor of Persian art, of Persian history, and the director of Cambridge Shahnama project. Please take a look at his CV to get a glimpse of his research on the subject. Dr. Melville will discuss the importance and the effect of the Shahnama on Persian art, history, scientific, and religious literature. The Shahnama basically represented Persian culture. It became a bridge linking pre-Islamic language to the new Persian as a literary language. Dr. Melville will discuss examples of the illustrated manuscripts of the Shahnama. He will also present the work of the Cambridge Shahnama project and its goal to develop the study of Islamic manuscripts. I will leave the details of that to Dr. Melville.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that very nice welcome, Mr. Badr Bizhan. And thank you all for coming in this stormy night. And I noticed from the brochure advertising these talks that it said it was introducing the whole program, and it said it was a tiring program. And so maybe you haven't been tired yet, and I hope that this won't be the last nail in the coffin, and you'll be so tired after this lecture that you won't come to any more. Anyway, it's very nice to be here, and I'd like to thank the Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah for the invitation. And it's my first visit to Kuwait. I nearly said Yemen then, my God. And I've never been to Yemen. So for here, and I hope it won't be my last one. Well, as you see, I'm talking about the Shahnama and the Persian arts of the book. And just a word to follow on the introduction. From the earliest surviving examples of illustrated copies of the Shahnama, which date from around 1300 up until the latest from the mid-19th century in Iran and northern India, Ferdowsi's celebrated poem has been most commonly and continuously illustrated work of Persian literature. The reasons for this lie beyond the intrinsic merits of the text and the popular appeal of its stories, which certainly lend themselves to illustration at the narrative level. Battles and combats between armies and champions, fights with dragons, demons, and other monsters, and rather rarer romantic and courtly interludes. The enduring appeal of the Shahnama can be found also in the perception of the poem as Iran's national epic and its distillation of Persian culture, political ethics, and national identity. Thus, as history, it tells the story of the Persian Empire from the early origins of human society up to the collapse of the Sasanian dynasty and the Muslim Arab conquests in the time of the Caliphs Omar and Uthman. Much of this history is taken up with the interaction of Iran and the nomads of Inner Asia, identified as the Turks or Turanians in the Shahnameh, and later with the Byzantines and the Arab lands of the Byzantine Empire, mainly in the Levant, but also echoing earlier connections with the Yemen. In other words, on the political level, it addresses Iran's place in the world vis-à-vis its neighbors and provides a living memorial of Iran's pre-Islamic imperial glory. Culturally speaking, Ferdowsi's poem promotes the values of adab, or courtly politeness, respect for authority and religion, knowledge, danesh, and learning, and faithfulness, wafa, in one's dealings. In terms of political ethics, the Shahnama focuses on the qualities needed for kingship, which apart from the God-given grace or charisma, or far, and royal descent of pure Iranian lineage, it requires above all the qualities of wisdom, khirad, and justice, adl, both of which involve suppressing greed, hastiness and rash decisions, and consulting with the wise, be they scholars or priests. The Shahnama is also celebrated for its use of the Persian language and for playing a major role in the emergence of New Persian as a literary language, although the use of Arabic words, including some key terms, as already noted, wafa, adl, is more widespread than is generally mentioned. It can also hardly be irrelevant that the poet was writing almost 400 years after the coming of Islam. Whatever his personal religious persuasion, which remains very ambiguous, it is likely that the values of his contemporary society also permeated his work, whether consciously or not, so that his poetry and his ethics sit perfectly comfortably with Muslim belief. And what I mean by this is, although it's still always spoken of as a great celebration of pre-Islamic Iran, the fact is there's nothing in his story that is offensive to Muslims. I mean, it doesn't mean pre-Islamic or Islamic is irrelevant. He was living and working in a Muslim context, and there's nothing in the values, it seems to me, that were put forward in the Shahnama that are somehow offensive to Islam. I mean, they drink a lot of wine, I know, but apart from that. In its own time, the full significance of Ferdowsi's work was nevertheless unappreciated. We can identify the evaluation of the text both as a symbol of Iranianness and as a preferred subject for copying and illustration, as starting in the Il-Khanid period in Iran. Following the Mongol conquests and the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, Iran's new rulers had first became at least partly acclimatized to Persian culture and ultimately also converted to Islam. The earliest manuscripts of the Shahnama to have survived date from 1217 and 1276, the last coinciding with the construction of the Il-Khanid palaces at Takhti Suleiman, with their superb glazed tiles bearing quotations from the poem, some of which are, of course, in the museums here. These texts, that's to say these early manuscripts, and another recently discovered from around the same time in Lebanon, are not illustrated, but this situation suddenly changes, apparently coinciding with the conversion of Ghazan Khan to Islam in 1294. So that by the mid-14th century, more than a dozen illustrated copies have been identified. So this is quite a dramatic change. I mean, we don't know, of course, if earlier copies had been illustrated but maybe destroyed in the Mongol invasions or, in the upheavals. But the fact is that there are no illustrated copies of the Shahnama until the Mongol period and until the beginning of the 14th century. And I believe this isn't just a coincidence. From this time, the popularity of the text has hardly faltered, and hundreds of manuscripts of the Shahnama have been illustrated, reaching a peak in the mid-17th century in the late Safavid period. So let us look first at some representative and outstanding examples of these illustrated manuscripts, from which we can also see some of the subjects most frequently chosen and popular with the artists and their patrons. Now, among these are the murder of Iraj. I'm not going to tell all these stories, or we'd be here all night, but there are 165 copies so far identified of this scene in the Shahnama project database, which I'll say a little bit about at the end. And another important scene is the death of Sohrab, killed by Rustam, over 240 pictures. The death of Siyavush, over 400. He had a fire ordeal and then he was murdered later. The transfer of power from Darius to Alexander. This is also obviously quite an important moment in terms of political ideology, because, of course, Alexander was a conqueror and, in fact, had destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, and yet this great sort of myth is created that, he marries Roshanak and he's sort of lying there. Darius is lying there saying, look after the Iranians, marry my daughter, everything's fine. It's actually fantasy. But, of course, this is an important scene for the continuity, the idea of the continuity of rule in Iran by legitimate rulers. Another very popular scene is Rustam's archetypal confrontation with the white Div, which I think stands for the basic confrontation between good and evil. By far the most popular of all, 274 pictures so far identified of this scene, and growing all the time. Other popular scenes which I will refer to are Bizhan's rescue from the pit and the death of Isfandiar, who's shot in the eyes by Rustam, as I'm sure you know. The comparison of the treatment of these subjects allows us to appreciate the changing style and iconography developed by the Persian artists over a long period. The succession of manuscripts of the highest quality produced at the royal ateliers or karkhanes starts with the great Mongol or Demot Shahnama around about 1335, in which there is a strong emphasis on the cycle of Alexander or Iskandar, at least in the paintings that have survived the brutal dismemberment of the manuscript. Thus, echoing the point made earlier about the Mongols' exposure to the culture of their subjects, we find a truly imperial depiction of the ruler as an aloof being. So this is Alexander here in the Mongol Shahnameh, seemingly detached from the events around him. And you'll notice he's got a sort of halo or a disc around his head. I mean, obviously, this is something completely alien to the depiction of rulers in the previous period, but harks back to the depiction of rulers in the pre-Islamic period. Whereas later depictions of princes enthroned tend to see them as being engaging at some level with the courtiers all around him. Here the king is just completely, it seems to me, detached from the events. He's staring straight out of the picture. And there are many scenes like this in the Demot Shahnameh. So it's really celebrating imperial rule. In the great Mongol Shahnameh, there's also a focus on the story of Iraj and his murder, which I mentioned before. This is an archetypal scene, and the reason is, very briefly, that, as you probably know, Iraj was murdered by his two brothers. He was a political innocent. They were jealous of his succession to the land of Iran. He said, I don't want to be ruler. I just want to retire and develop my spiritual personality. And nevertheless, the brothers murdered him, and this set off the endless vendetta between the Iranians and the Turanians, the resolution of which dominated the whole first legendary portion of the poem. The story of Iraj also provides an early paradigm of the martyred innocent, which is reinforced in the later story of Siyavush and chimes so sympathetically with the Iranian Shi'i religious sentiment. Of course, with the martyrdom of Hussein, for instance. In terms of artistic expression, the Demot Shahnameh is a one-off. I mean, we see here an extraordinary sort of passion and emotion, really, in the paintings, which have a power that you very seldom find in later work. A group of three almost exactly contemporary copies made for the three grandsons of Timur between about 1425 and 1440 are also remarkable for their inventiveness and the high quality of their execution. As much for the illuminations as for the pictures themselves. This is the Ibrahim Sultan one, the first of them, in Shiraz, made in Shiraz about 1425, pioneering a powerful minimalist compositions that rendered the scenes in their essentials. The illumination is fantastic in this manuscript as well. It's actually of a higher quality than the paintings. It's also very idiosyncratic. I mean, this is the famous story of Bizhan coming out of the well that I mentioned. And you see here the artist has found this clever way of sort of indicating that the well is underground. And he's really used the text to separate the scene above, which is Rustam looking down and getting ready to pull him out, and Bizhan down below. This doesn't happen again in any other manuscript. It's a really very remarkable. There are many very remarkable paintings in this particular copy. Rather in contrast, copies made for his brother Baysunkur and Muhammad Juki in 1430 and 1440, respectively, in Herat, contain a high degree of abstraction, in that the emphasis seems to be as much on the surface brilliance of the execution as on the narrative moment itself. This is the Baysunkur manuscript. It's in Tehran. I mean, this is most incredibly beautifully illuminated. And on the left, we see Rustam killing the white Div in the Baysunkur Shahnama, and in this side, it's the Muhammad Juki Shahnama, his brother. It's produced about 10 years later. And two more, a pair from also the same two manuscripts. This is the Baysunkur one. This is the execution of Siyavush. It's rather an odd painting in a way, but the sort of composition, I suppose, leads you around to the focal point there. And here it's perhaps a little bit more direct. This is from the Muhammad Juki one. As I mentioned, of course, the execution of Siyavush, I think, really touches a nerve with Iranian religious sensibility, because he, again, was an innocent and a martyr, and he somehow went knowingly to his death at the hands of Afrasiab and his treacherous brother. This is another one from here. I mean, of course, there is some action. I'm not trying to say that they're not depicting the story. It's just that the whole thing is so incredibly beautiful that the sort of brutality of the scene, which you find in the earlier pictures, I mean, you realize that you're actually having a fight. Here it's there's some sort of a ballet going on. It's really, it seems to me that the beauty of the picture has overcome really the message that might be coming across from it. This tendency to technical perfection reached its peak in the work done for Shah Tahmasp, the so-called Houghton Shahnameh, probably started for Shah Ismail, who died in 1524, but completed for Tahmasp in about 1540, employing the most celebrated artists of the Timurid court in Herat, the former Timurid court in Herat. This is the fire ordeal of Siyavush, which we haven't had before. I mentioned, I'm sure you know, that first of all, he had to prove his innocence once against the accusation that he had tried to seduce Kaykavusi's wife by going through a fire ordeal, which of course proved he emerged unscathed, and then later, as we saw before, he was treacherously murdered. This magnificent, heavily illustrated copy has made subsequent efforts seem rather second-rate, although some important manuscripts were copied at royal command for the short-reigned Shah Ismail II and later Shah Abbas. This is the Shah Ismail II manuscript, a picture of the same subject, which hasn't got quite the finish or the brilliance of colouring either that the Shah Tahmasp one had. An interesting group of manuscripts was illustrated in the 1640s, and again, artists of the renown of Mu'in Musawwir produced several copies in the following decades. This is the same subject, the fire ordeal of Siyavush. This is from a manuscript in St. Petersburg, the famous Dawn 333, made in about 1651, and this is an example of Mu'in Musawwir's version of the same story, made in 1664. The influence of Western painting and the adoption of Mannerist poses, pale pastel hues, and a sense of perspective all show the Iranian artist's continuing adaptability and inventiveness to endow well-worn subjects with a new liveliness. Well, so much for the Shahnameh itself. It's clearly a work of enormous significance in Iranian culture. We can observe various measures of the impact of the work on later generations. Among others, I will draw attention to three. First, there's the literary impact. Second, the visual influence of Shahnameh illustrations on other works. And thirdly, what might be called the reciprocal impact of iconography of scenes in other literary works being re-imported back into the Shahnameh and its illustrations. Well, we're particularly concerned here with the last 2 points. That's to say, the impact of the visual the visual impact of the Shahnama paintings on other works, and the way this is sort of feeds back into illustrations of the Shahnama. But in reality, all three elements are to some degree interrelated. From the literary perspective, that's the first point then, later poets attempted to fill out some of the stories from the so-called Sistan cycles of narratives of the House of Sistan, House of Rustam, that were left incomplete or ignored altogether by Ferdowsi. The most significant of these were Asadi Tusi's Gashasp Name, the Barzu Name, which followed the fortunes of Suhrab's son, who narrowly avoided being killed by Rustam as his father had been, thanks to the timely intervention of his mother. That's what's going on here. He's just about to kill Barzu in both these pictures, and then luckily his mother turns up and says, hang on a moment, you know, that's your grandson. And so the disaster of killing his son is not repeated. There's also the Bahman Name, is quite a popular story recounting the revenge of Isfandiar's son on the house of Rustam for killing Isfandiar. Occasionally, these narratives were reproduced in their own right. That's to say, in separate manuscripts or separate copies. But from around 1425 or so at least, that's to say the early Timurid period, they were frequently introduced or interpolated into copies of the Shahnama itself, thus almost becoming a part of the work. So in many manuscripts of the Shahnama, you get the text of the Barzu Name or the Bahman Name, almost as though it is actually a part of the story, and later poets and copyists obviously felt that it should be included. Scenes from these interpolations were often illustrated along with scenes from the main text. Well, later epic poets, such as Nizami of Ganja, who died in 1209, and Amir Khusro Dehlavi, who was writing around 1302, and the poet Jami, also refer to Ferdowsi's poem in their retelling and improving of the versions of the stories, such as Bahram Gur and the slave girl Fitne, or Azadeh, or Dilaram, I should say, Khusra and Shirin, and there's also Yusuf and Zuleika, of course, from Jami, or stories of Iskandar. These works too were illustrated and could be indistinguishable from Shahnama paintings in the absence of the text. Well, this point isn't very well made here, but this is a Shahnama Bahram Gur with Fitne, killing these poor